You walked into a room and forgot why you went there. Your doctor said it's just aging. New research says he was looking at the wrong organ. Every conversation about memory loss after 60 focused on the brain, scans, neurons, plaques. Most people following every recommendation were never told their gut might be driving what's happening upstairs. In March 2026, Stanford published a study in Nature tracing a three-step pathway: gut bacteria, vagus nerve, hippocampus. In aged animals, this pathway was disrupted and memory declined. 3 different interventions restored it. Cognitive performance returned to youthful levels. The vagus nerve devices they used are already FDA-cleared for other conditions. In this video, the exact mechanism, the bacteria involved, and 3 things you can do today to protect this pathway while the treatments advance. This is what the research actually says, not what you've been told.
There is a nerve running from your gut to your brain right now. It's called the vagus nerve. It carries more than 80% of its signals in one direction, not from brain to gut, but from gut to brain. And according to research published in Nature just a few months ago, when that signal gets disrupted, when the pipeline gets blocked, the hippocampus, the part of your brain that forms and stores new memories, starts to go quiet. That's not a metaphor, that's a mechanism. A 3-step pathway traced in detail for the first time at Stanford Medicine and the Arc Institute, showing that what starts in your intestine ends in your memory. And look, I want to say something here before we get into the science, because I've been sitting with this study for weeks, and I keep coming back to one question. I'm not your doctor. Nothing I say in this video is medical advice, and that's exactly why I can say something your doctor may not have had time to say yet. The research on where memory loss actually starts has fundamentally changed, and most people sitting in most waiting rooms have not been told. My father had multiple strokes over years, spent more time in hospital rooms than I can count. Different doctors had every admission. Everyone focused on his brain, what was happening at that moment, in that scan, in that episode. Nobody, not one of them, ever asked what was happening in his gut. I spent years reading the research, trying to understand what we missed. I still don't have a complete answer, but this study got me closer than anything I've read before. Drop a comment right now with just your age, nothing else. I want to see who's watching, because what I'm about to show you matters differently depending on exactly where you are right now. For most of modern medicine, memory loss after 60 was treated as a brain problem, full stop. The logic made sense. The hippocampus shrinks, neurons die, connections weaken, and you forget. So the research focused on the brain: scans, plaques, beta amyloid, tau proteins, billions of dollars, decades of trials. And some of that research has been valuable. But here's the question the Stanford team started asking a few years ago. Why does memory decline affect people so differently? Some people are cognitively sharp at 90. Others start losing edge in their 50s. If this were purely a brain aging story, you'd expect more consistency. You don't get it. Something else is driving the variance. Think about what that looks like from the inside. A man who used to remember every name at every meeting, birthdays, appointments, the exact words of conversations from 3 years ago, starts reaching for words that aren't there. His doctor runs the standard tests, normal range, and then he's told, this is just aging. Sit with that for a second. Just aging, as if that were the end of the sentence. The Stanford team suspected it wasn't. And what they found is that the variation in cognitive aging, the difference between the person who's sharp at 90 and the person who starts slipping at 60, may be driven not by what's happening in the brain, but what was happening in the gut. Nobody told you that. Has your doctor ever mentioned the gut-brain connection in the context of your memory, or did the conversation start and end with the brain?
The gut has been changing with age in ways we didn't fully understand until recently, and those changes appear to be sending signals upward through a highway most people have never heard of to the very structure that determines whether you remember where you put your keys.
That highway is the vagus nerve, and in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what's traveling on it and what happens when the signal gets cut. Here's what the Stanford team found. The gut microbiome, the ecosystem of bacteria living in your intestine, changes with age. That part wasn't new. What was new was what they found happening as a result of those changes. As we get older, one bacterium in particular increases in the gut. Its name is Parabacteroides goldsteinii. You've probably never heard of it, most people haven't. But what it does as its numbers climb is produce something called medium-chain fatty acids, metabolites that accumulate in the gut wall. And here's where it gets specific. Those fatty acids activate a receptor called GPR84 on immune cells in the gut wall, immune cells called myeloid cells. When GPR84 gets activated, those immune cells trigger an inflammatory response, not in the brain, in the gut, a local fire. But that local fire has a remote consequence. The inflammation disrupts the activity of the vagus nerve, the nerve that's supposed to be carrying continuous signals from your intestine up to your brain. The signal weakens. The hippocampus, which depends on that input, receives less of it, and memory formation, the process of encoding new experiences, new information, new faces, becomes harder. The study describes this as interoceptive dysfunction. And let me be precise about what that means because it matters. Interoception is the brain's ability to sense the internal state of the body. We usually talk about it in terms of hunger, heartbeat, breath. But it turns out the brain also relies on gut signals to contextualize memory formation. When those signals weaken, memory formation itself is compromised. This is the three-step pathway the Stanford team traced. Step 1, gut bacteria change with age, increasing Parabacteroides goldsteinii and the medium-chain fatty acids it produces. Step 2, those fatty acids activate inflammatory immune cells in the gut wall, disrupting vagus nerve signaling. Step 3, the weakened vagal signal reaches the hippocampus and hippocampal activity declines. 3 steps from your gut to your memory. A woman in her mid-60s. Every morning she and her husband went over the day's schedule at the kitchen table. Who needed to be where, what needed to get done. She prided herself on never needing to write it down. Then one morning, her husband mentioned an appointment they'd discussed the night before. She had no memory of the conversation. Not the appointment, the conversation. Her doctor said this was expected at her age. The research now suggests something was happening in her gut that nobody checked. Now here's the part of this study that I want you to hear carefully, because it's the part that most coverage of this research has undersold. The Stanford team didn't just trace the pathway, they proved causality, not correlation. They took young mice, 2 months old, and colonized their guts with the aged microbiome of old mice, with just Parabacteroides goldsteinii. And the young mice developed the cognitive profile of aged animals. They performed worse on memory tasks. They showed reduced hippocampal activity. Youth didn't protect them. The gut bacteria overrode it. Write this down. The study was published in Nature on March 11, 2026, led by Dr. Christoph A. Theis at Stanford Medicine and the Arc Institute. This is not preliminary data. This is peer-reviewed, published in one of the highest impact journals in science. Has this matched anything you've experienced, or were you told something completely different about why this was happening? If you're watching this and thinking this might explain something I've been living with for years, type yes in the comments. I read every single one. Before I get to the part that changes everything, the 3 things the researchers did to reverse it, I need you to understand one more piece of the mechanism, because it changes what you should be asking for. Now here's what most people are getting wrong about this study. The coverage focused on the discovery, the bacterium,
The pathway, the mechanism, that's the science headline. But the most important finding isn't that the researchers traced where memory loss starts, it's that they reversed it. And I need to be very clear about what reversed means here and what it doesn't. This was done in animal models. The pathway to human treatment is not complete.
But the degree of reversal they observed and the 3 different ways they achieved it is why I consider this the most significant piece of gut-brain research published in years. 3 separate interventions, 3 different approaches, all 3 worked. Write this down. The first intervention targeted the bacteria directly. Bacteriophages, viruses that infect specific bacteria without affecting others, were used to eliminate Parabacteroides goldsteinii from the aged gut. When the bacterium was gone, the inflammation signal stopped, the vagus nerve recovered, and the aged mice performed on memory tasks at levels comparable to young animals. The second intervention blocked the inflammation directly. Instead of targeting the bacteria, the researchers blocked the inflammatory response at the level of the gut immune cells, cutting the GPR84 pathway that was translating bacterial metabolites into disrupted nerve signals. Same result. Memory performance improved to youthful levels. The third intervention went directly to the nerve itself. Chemical stimulation of the vagus nerve, activating the pathway from the gut side, restored hippocampal function, even with the dysfunctional bacteria still present in the gut. 3 interventions, 3 different targets, 1 outcome: memory restored. Now here's what that means practically, and this is the part your doctor may not have had time to read yet. Devices that electrically stimulate the vagus nerve already exist. They're already FDA-cleared, approved for epilepsy and treatment-resistant depression. The hardware is not theoretical. The question that researchers are now beginning to investigate is whether vagal stimulation has a role in protecting cognitive function as we age. That research is in early stages. I'm not telling you to seek out a vagal nerve stimulator for your memory. What I am telling you is that the translational pathway from this animal research to clinical application is shorter than it would be for most discoveries because part of the infrastructure already exists. An older man, 72, sharp his whole career, started noticing over about 18 months that names were taking longer to arrive. He'd reach for a word mid-sentence, a word he'd used 1,000 times, and it wasn't there. His doctor told him this was normal cognitive aging. His gut microbiome was never discussed. His diet was never reviewed in the context of cognitive health. The connection wasn't on the map. It's on the map now. In my view, and I say this having gone through this literature for months, the most overlooked conversation in medicine right now is the connection between gut health and cognitive aging, not as a soft wellness concept, as a hard biological mechanism with identified pathways, identified targets, and now identified interventions that actually worked in a controlled research setting. The guidelines your doctors follow were mostly written before this research existed. Nobody told you that. And now, because I said at the beginning of this video that I would give you what you can actually do today, let me be honest about the gap. The 3 interventions in the Stanford study are not yet available as clinical treatments for age-related memory decline. They're research findings. But here's what the research does tell you about protecting this pathway with what you already have. Here's what the research tells you to do today, not instead of your doctor, alongside them and with better questions than you've been able to ask before. 3 concrete steps. All 3 are supported by research on the gut-brain axis and cognitive aging. None of them require a prescription. Step 1. Reduce the conditions that feed P. goldsteinii overgrowth. The bacterium that drives this pathway proliferates in aging guts. What reduces it? Dietary fiber,
specifically prebiotic fiber that feeds competing bacteria and disrupts overgrowth dynamics. The Mediterranean diet pattern, with its emphasis on vegetables, legumes, olive oil, and fermented foods, has been associated in multiple studies with reduced gut inflammation and better cognitive outcomes in adults over 60. A review published in Frontiers in Molecular Neuroscience in February 2026 looked at the relationship between the Mediterranean diet, gut microbiome, and memory performance. The findings showed a consistent neuroprotective association, not from a single food, but from the overall pattern.
Specifically, higher levels of short-chain fatty acids, the beneficial kind, correlated with better performance on memory tasks in older adults. Write this down. If your diet currently includes highly processed foods, minimal fiber, and few fermented foods, that's where to start. Not with a supplement, with the pattern. And look, I know this doesn't feel like the answer. You came here expecting to hear about a drug, a test, a device, something specific, and I understand that. But the research is telling you something specific. The gut environment that feeds P. goldsteinii is partially modifiable through diet. That's not a wellness suggestion, that's mechanism-level biology. Step 2. Bring this research to your next appointment. Most physicians are not yet connecting gut health to cognitive concerns. The Stanford research is new. Your doctor may not have seen it. The question to ask is, I read a Stanford study in Nature, March 2026, about the gut vagus nerve hippocampus pathway and memory decline. Should we factor this into how I'm managing my cognitive health? That question opens a conversation that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It signals that you are an informed participant, not a passive recipient. A recommendation is not a verdict. Neither is a diagnosis. Step 3. Protect vagal tone through non-pharmacological means. The vagus nerve is the highway. Anything that supports its function supports this pathway. The research on vagal tone and cognitive health is a developing field, but several interventions have evidence behind them. Diaphragmatic breathing, slow, deliberate belly breathing has been shown to activate vagal tone measurably. Cold water exposure to the face, humming, singing, none of these are new ideas. What's new is the mechanism that connects them to memory. A woman who started practicing 10 minutes of slow breathing every morning, not because she'd read about vagal tone, because she wanted to feel less anxious. She sat at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, coffee cooling beside her, breathing in for 4 counts and out for 6. She didn't know she might also be sending better signals to her hippocampus. Now she does. You are not a passive recipient of what aging does to your memory. You are an informed participant in your own health. The Alzheimer's Association 2026 Facts and Figures Report, published in partnership with the NIH, estimates that 7.4 million Americans aged 65 and older are currently living with clinical Alzheimer's dementia. That number is projected to reach 13.8 million by 2060 without medical breakthroughs to prevent it. The gut may be a modifiable factor in that trajectory. That's not hope as a consolation, that's research as a direction. Here's what we covered today. 1. A study in Nature traced a 3-step pathway from gut bacteria to the vagus nerve to the hippocampus, showing the gut is an active driver of age-related memory decline, not a bystander. 2. The pathway was reversed in animal models through 3 distinct interventions: bacteriophages, anti-inflammatory targeting, and vagal stimulation, with FDA-cleared devices already existing for the 3rd approach. 3. Today, the most evidence-based steps are a gut-protective dietary pattern, bringing this research to your physician, and supporting vagal tone through accessible daily practices. If you're walking away from this video differently than you walked in, Drop informed in the comments. I want to know who's here. If this is the kind of research you want to keep seeing, the subscribe button is right there. I don't post every day. When I post, it's because something changed in the literature that you need to know. There's someone in your life who's been told it's just aging. You know who it is. Send them this video before their next appointment. Of the 3 steps I just covered, the diet pattern, the conversation with your doctor, or the vagal tone practices, which one are you starting this week? I read the research so you can walk into that appointment and have a real conversation, not just nod and leave with no new information. I'm not your doctor. I'm the person who learned the hard way that being informed is not optional.